On Thanksgiving, I exposed my husband's betrayal in front of everyone. Thanksgiving morning always carried a sense of warmth and ritual in our house. The kind of familiarity that wrapped around you like a soft blanket. I woke to the gentle hum of the coffee maker in the kitchen, the scent of freshly brewed coffee mixing with the faint aroma of cinnamon from the pumpkin pie my mother had started baking the night before. The sunlight filtered through the curtains just enough to make the kitchen feel golden, and for a moment, I allowed myself to breathe in the comfort of routine. I patted down the hall in my slippers, careful not to wake the kids who had sprawled across the living room couch in various stages of sleep. Their small movements, the occasional giggle or stir, reminded me how much I loved this day. The chaos of family, the laughter, the traditions. Even the cat, sprawled on the rug in the hallway, seemed to know it was a special morning, flicking its tail lazily as I passed. There was a softness to it, a sense that everything was exactly as it should be. The house smelled like Thanksgiving already, even before the turkey went into the oven. My husband was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with a kind of mechanical precision, humming quietly to himself. I watched him for a moment, noticing how the morning light caught in his hair, how his hands moved deftly but a little too tensely over the knife. Something about him seemed slightly off, though I couldn't put my finger on it. Perhaps it was just the early morning fatigue, or maybe my imagination. I poured myself a cup of coffee and settled at the kitchen counter, taking in the sight of our home. The table was already set with the fine china, the silverware polished, the napkins folded in little triangles. The house was warm, the smell of roasted turkey still faint in the air, mingling with butter and herbs. I could hear my mother in the background, humming as she carried dishes from the oven, her presence both comforting and grounding. The normalcy of it all made me feel safe, and yet a small, uneasy, prickling tug at the edges of my mind. He glanced at his phone while chopping, just for a second, but it was enough to notice the subtle tension in his posture. His brows knitted slightly as he read whatever message had arrived, a faint sigh escaping him before he tucked the phone back into his pocket. I forced a smile, trying to ignore the flicker of something unfamiliar in his eyes. It was small, almost imperceptible, but I couldn't shake it. That tiny shift made me wonder if I was imagining things, a momentary paranoia seeded by too many late nights scrolling through headlines or true crime stories. The kids began stirring, their laughter filling the hallway as they stumbled into the kitchen, rubbing eyes and dragging blankets behind them. I noticed my husband's attention waver, his eyes darting toward the hallway whenever they giggled, almost as if he were distracted by something beyond the usual morning bustle. He smiled at them, but it felt practiced, forced. My heart tightened slightly, though I tried to push the feeling aside. It was probably nothing. After all, he was always so busy with work this time of year, and perhaps this was just his way of coping with the chaos of the day. I reached for a plate to help with breakfast, the faint warmth of my coffee in hand grounding me as I moved across the kitchen. The knives and cutting boards were neatly arranged, the counters cluttered only with things that belonged there. A bag of fresh cranberries, a stick of butter, a rolling pin dusted with flour. Everything seemed perfect, almost too perfect, and I caught myself wondering why my unease had started to creep in so early. I reminded myself that it was normal to feel a little off when the day carried so many expectations. While I buttered the toast, I noticed my husband glance toward the living room, almost nervously, before returning to the vegetables. There was a slight tightness in his jaw I hadn't seen in months, a subtle stiffness in his shoulders that made him seem smaller, somehow, under the bright morning. Son, I try to chalk it up to holiday stress, the pressure to entertain, to manage a house full of family. Yet, the feeling persisted, whispering that perhaps the day's perfection was only surface deep. I took a deep breath, inhaling the mingling scents of roasted turkey and sweet pie, letting it fill me with a sense of gratitude. The house was alive with movement, my parents bustling around, kids laughing, and my husband chopping vegetables, but beneath the comfort, a faint tension lingered. It was almost imperceptible, like a shadow stretching across the kitchen floor that didn't belong. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself I was being overly sensitive, that holidays often brought unexpected stress. The phone on the counter buzzed again, and I caught a glimpse of the message before he slid it away. Something about the way he stiffened, a fleeting hesitation, made me pause mid-bite of toast. I try not to read too much into it, telling myself it was probably a work message, something trivial that didn't involve me. But still, the unease took root, small and insistent, like a whisper at the edge of my mind that I couldn't ignore. I poured another cup of coffee, letting the steam warm my hands, and glanced around the room. The table was perfectly arranged, the windows letting in the soft, golden light of late morning. The kids now sitting cross-legged on the rug, playing quietly. Everything should have felt safe, cozy, and happy. Yet, the dissonance lingered, subtle and gnawing, as if I had stumbled into a familiar scene that held a hidden secret just out of sight. I shook my head slightly, trying to focus on the ordinary sounds of Thanksgiving. As I moved toward the sink to rinse my cup, I caught another glance of him, a fleeting expression of distraction, a small, almost imperceptible pause before he smiled at me. Something inside me twisted, a tiny seed of suspicion that I couldn't quite name. The morning was unfolding as it always had, familiar and comforting, yet there was a quiet shift beneath it all, a subtle tension that made my stomach knot. It was not fear, not yet, but an uneasy awareness that perhaps, this Thanksgiving, something wasn't quite right. I lingered in the kitchen for a few moments longer, letting the smells and sounds wash over me, trying to hold on to the warmth of the morning. The laughter of the kids, the clatter of dishes, the faint sizzle from the oven, all of it should have felt safe, ordinary, perfect. And yet, in the small, quiet spaces between each sound, I noticed the subtle cues, the distracted glance, the sudden sigh, the whispered phone alert, that planted the tiniest hint of doubt. I couldn't explain it, but I felt it, a soft, insistent whisper that told me I needed to pay attention. The morning continued its rhythm, and I moved through it with deliberate calm, tasting the cinnamon from the pie, feeling the warmth of the coffee cup, listening to the chatter of my family. And in that quiet, ordinary moment, as the sunlight caught dust motes floating lazily in the air, I realized that beneath the familiar, comforting rituals, a subtle unease had begun to take hold. It was faint, almost ignorable, but unmistakable. And as I straightened a napkin on the counter and sipped my coffee, I couldn't shake the feeling that something important, was about to disturb our perfect Thanksgiving. After breakfast, the house settled into a quieter rhythm. The kids had retreated upstairs to play, their laughter now echoing faintly from the hallway, and the adults moved between kitchen and living room, tidying and chatting in low tones. I sank into the sofa with my coffee, letting the warmth seep into my hands, and watched my husband across the room. He seemed almost mechanical in his movements, chopping vegetables, setting plates, but something about his focus fell off. I tried to remind myself that marriages have ebbs and flows, that everyone has moments of distraction. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was a wall between us that hadn't been there before. Our conversations were polite but brief, the kind that exchanged information but not emotion. He smiled when I approached, yet the warmth didn't quite reach his eyes. The dissonance gnawed at me, subtle but insistent, like a quiet warning I couldn't ignore. I reflected on our life together, the routines we had built, the trust we had cultivated over years, the moments that had made our relationship feel unshakable. It was a life I had cherished, a partnership I had believed in with everything I had. And yet, as I watched him move through the motions of the morning, an unfamiliar tension stirred in my chest. The sense that something was off hovered at the edge of my awareness, impossible to shake. Small details that normally would have gone unnoticed began to stick out. The way he glanced at his phone too quickly when a notification arrived. The subtle avoidance of eye contact when I asked about his day yesterday. Even the faint sigh he let out when I made a simple suggestion for the meal prep felt loaded with meaning. Each tiny clue, on its own, might have seemed insignificant, but together they created a puzzle I couldn't yet solve. I found myself drifting back to memories of our marriage, the laughter, the long talks late at night, the small adventures we had taken together. Nostalgia tugged at my heart, a reminder of why I loved him, why I had chosen him. But alongside that warmth was a prickling unease, an internal whisper that warned me to pay attention. It was confusing to feel such deep affection while simultaneously sensing a shadow of betrayal. My mother popped into the kitchen, humming as she carried a tray of muffins. "Everything smells amazing," she said, setting it down with a smile. I returned the smile, grateful for her presence, but even her cheerful energy couldn't push away the tight, knot forming in my stomach. I noticed my husband stiffened slightly when she entered, a subtle shift in posture, almost like he had been caught off guard. It was the kind of thing I might have laughed off on any other day, but today it added to the growing unease. We moved through casual conversation, discussing the menu, who would carve the turkey, and whether the kids wanted an extra slice of pie. But beneath the polite chatter, I could feel an invisible tension building. It was like walking on a thin sheet of ice, the surface calm, but the pressure underneath growing with each passing moment. My heart beat a little faster, my palms slightly clammy, and I realized that the sense of unease was no longer ignorable. As I poured another cup of coffee, I noticed my husband glance toward the hallway, almost reflexively, before returning to his tasks. There was a nervousness in his hands, a tightness around his eyes that seemed out of place in the otherwise cozy morning. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps he was just stressed, worried about the meal, or preoccupied with work, but the feeling didn't dissipate. It lingered, wrapping itself around my awareness like a thin, cold mist. A minor interaction with one of the kids brought a fleeting smile to his face, and for a moment, I thought perhaps I had been reading too much into the tension. But the smile faded quickly, and he returned to chopping with a kind of detached efficiency that made my chest ache. I realized that my intuition was telling me something I didn't yet fully understand but could not ignore. The sense of being excluded, of not fully knowing the person beside me, gnawed quietly at the edges of my mind. By late morning, I found myself observing him more closely than usual. The way he moved around the kitchen, the slight tremor in his hand as he carried dishes, the way he seemed almost hesitant to speak to me directly, all of it contributed to a rising tide of suspicion. I felt a mix of love, anxiety, and dread, emotions that twisted together in a confusing knot. The comfort of routine had dulled, replaced by a subtle but undeniable alertness. I tried to focus on mundane tasks, checking the table settings, brushing crumbs from the counters, making sure the cranberry sauce was chilled. But every sound, every movement felt heightened, as if the house itself were conspiring to reveal a hidden truth. I caught glimpses of his distracted expressions, tiny hesitations, small changes in tone that I had never noticed before. My heart pounded softly in my chest, a quiet drum of anticipation and fear. As I stepped back to survey the kitchen, everything appeared normal at first glance. The counters were clean, the turkey was roasting, the sunlight streaming through the windows was warm and familiar. Yet beneath that surface, a subtle tension had taken root, almost imperceptible but undeniably present. I sipped my coffee, letting the warmth calm my hands, and tried to convince myself that perhaps it was just holiday stress, a fleeting worry that would pass. And yet, as I watched him carefully arrange the utensils for dinner, I noticed a small, peculiar hesitation in his movements, a flicker of distraction that I could not ignore. It was subtle, almost insignificant, but it set my mind racing. My chest tightened, a soft ache of anticipation and unease settling deep inside me. I realized that this quiet, uneasy calm was a fragile veil, and somewhere beneath it, something in our Thanksgiving morning was quietly unraveling that I often found myself drifting back to the early days of our marriage, the way everything had felt electric and effortless, as if the universe had aligned just for us. I remember the first time we met, how he had smiled at me across that crowded cafe, his eyes warm, curious, full of intent. The memory made my chest tighten with longing, a mixture of sweetness and ache, because those days now seemed so distant, almost fragile in retrospect. We had been inseparable in the beginning, exploring the city hand in hand, laughing at silly movies, staying up late, talking about dreams and futures we were certain we would build together. He was ambitious but gentle, charming in a way that made you believe he could carry the weight of the world without ever losing his lightness. I had fallen hard, unreservedly, swept away in the intensity of his attention and the comfort of his presence. Our wedding had been small, but perfect. Family and a few close friends, laughter echoing through the garden as the sun set behind us. I remembered the way he had held my hand as we recited our vows, his thumb brushing over mine, steady and warm. I thought then that there could be no storm that would touch us, no secret that could fracture the bond we had forged in those early, blissful months. The first few years of marriage had been just that, warm, full of shared dreams of building a home, decorating rooms, planning holidays and vacations. Every morning had begun with shared coffee and sleepy smiles. Every evening had ended in conversation or quiet companionship. He had seemed perfect, like the person I had been waiting for, the partner I had always hoped to find. And for a long time, that perception held. But as time passed, subtle cracks began to appear. Minor disagreements over money, odd excuses for being late, fleeting tensions that we brushed off as stress or fatigue. I remembered moments when he would glance at his phone and smile faintly, then quickly put it away, or when he would get called into work unexpectedly and disappear without explanation. I tried to dismiss it, attributing it to normal life pressures, convincing myself that I was imagining things, that suspicion was a betrayal of trust. Still, the little things kept adding up, accumulating like shadows in the corners of our home. I noticed that some nights he would stay up late typing on his laptop in the spare room, leaving a faint smell of coffee and cologne behind. I sometimes found receipts or charges that didn't make sense, small enough to ignore, but large enough to prick at my mind. At the time, I told myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking, that love required trust above all. Despite these small hints, there were moments that reminded me why I loved him, why I had chosen him. The way he would laugh with our friends, the way he would hold my hand in crowded rooms, the quiet evenings when he would share his thoughts and listen to mine with undivided attention. Those moments made the doubts retreat, made me want to believe that everything was normal, that our marriage was still intact, strong, and unbreakable. Yet the unease persisted, subtle but nagging. His phone had become almost a barrier between us, his quick dismissals and vague answers leaving a residue of doubt. I found myself paying attention to his tone of voice, to the pauses in conversation, to the way he avoided certain topics. There was a quiet tension that I couldn't place, a sense that beneath the surface of our seemingly perfect life, something was hidden. I remember lying in bed at night, listening to his steady breathing and feeling a tiny pang of suspicion. The darkness made every creak of the house louder, every phone vibration more pronounced. I told myself repeatedly that I was imagining things, that love required trust, that marriage was about patience and faith. And yet, deep down, I couldn't ignore the growing sense that some part of him, some secret corner of his life, was slipping past my notice. The small red flags became more noticeable over time, though I still rationalized them away. A secretive smile at a text, an unexpected meeting, a brief flush of irritation when I asked a simple question. They were tiny, almost imperceptible, but together they formed a pattern I couldn't deny. Each one left me wondering if my perfect marriage had been an illusion, a carefully maintained facade that masked something deeper, something troubling. I tried to anchor myself in the love we had shared, in the happy memories, the moments of connection that had once felt unbreakable. I clung to them as evidence that all was well, convincing myself that doubt was a dangerous intruder, a seed of paranoia. Yet, the intuition that something was wrong grew quietly, steadily, a persistent whisper in the back of my mind that refused to be silenced. Even as I remembered the joys, the tenderness, and the laughter, I could not ignore the shadows that had begun to creep into our life. The contrast between what I wanted to see and what I was beginning to sense created a tension that settled deep in my chest, a mix of longing and fear, of hope and uncertainty. I realized that nostalgia alone could not shield me from the truth I was slowly beginning to glimpse. It was a delicate, painful awareness. The marriage I had thought was perfect had always had layers I hadn't fully seen, hidden corners where secrets could dwell. I wanted to believe the best, to cling to love, but the growing evidence of distraction, secrecy, and minor inconsistencies pressed against my heart, soft but insistent. I found myself questioning the line between innocent quirk and warning sign, between ordinary life and betrayal. And in that quiet reflection, as I sipped my coffee and watched the sunlight move across the living room floor, I realized that our marriage, for all its outward perfection, held subtle fractures. They were easy to miss, easy to excuse, but they were there. A part of me longed to ignore them, to hold on to the warmth of memory. Yet another part of me understood that my unease was valid, a soft alarm signaling that everything was not as it seemed. Over the months, little incidents began to pile up in a way I couldn't simply dismiss. At first, they were minor, a vague excuse here, a miscall there, but over time, they formed a pattern that made my stomach knot. I found myself replaying moments in my head, analyzing them again and again, trying to convince myself that I was reading too much into ordinary life. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. One afternoon, I noticed an unexplained charge on our joint account. It was small, just a few $100s, but enough to make me pause. When I asked about it, he offered a vague explanation, muttering something about work-related expenses, though the details didn't quite add up. I felt a flicker of doubt, a prickling of unease I tried to push aside. I told myself I was overthinking. After all, he had a demanding job, and mistakes happen, but the seed of suspicion had been planted. There were other little signs, too. I would find receipts tucked into drawers, small notes with names I didn't recognize, or text that flashed briefly on his phone before he tucked it away. Each one seemed insignificant in isolation, easy to explain or rationalize. But together, they began to accumulate like a quiet drumbeat in the background, persistent and impossible to ignore. I felt torn between the love I still held for him and the gnawing sense that I was being kept in the dark. I tried to rationalize everything, convincing myself that I had no right to question him. That doubt was a betrayal in itself. I would replay the happy memories, the warmth of his touch, the laughter we shared on weekend mornings, and tell myself that my instincts were exaggerating, that love sometimes required blind trust. Yet, every small inconsistency added weight to the unease I couldn't shake. The strange behavior became more noticeable at home. He would leave the room when a text came in, suddenly distracted, or take calls in another room, whispering quietly. When I asked what was wrong, he would smile and dismiss it as work stress, his tone casual but slightly guarded. I wanted to believe him, to cling to the version of our life that felt safe and familiar, but the tension lingered, subtle and insistent. One evening, I found myself sifting through emails on his laptop, something I had never done before, driven by a quiet urgency I could neither explain nor deny. There were messages that seemed harmless at first glance, brief, polite exchanges with colleagues, but some felt off, oddly intimate or secretive in tone. I closed the laptop quickly, guilt prickling at my chest, telling myself that curiosity was a slippery slope, that trust required restraint. Yet the unease only deepened. I remembered the times when he would disappear for hours without clear explanation, citing work meetings or errands, yet sometimes returning with small inconsistencies in his story. A lunch he supposedly had with a coworker that didn't check out, a meeting that seemed to end sooner than he had said. I began cataloging these events in my mind, trying to see a logical pattern, but all I found was growing anxiety and an inability to fully trust. Even friends began to notice subtle changes. During casual conversations, they would glance at him a certain way, whispering something behind their hands. At first, I brushed it off, assuming they were just being overly observant or mistaken. But each comment, each fleeting look, added to a sense of something lurking beneath the surface, something I couldn't yet name. The more I tried to ignore these signs, the more they seemed to demand attention. Small details, the quick flash of a text, a hurried tone, a shrug when questioned, became impossible to dismiss. I began to feel a growing tension in my chest, a restless knot that pulsed quietly with each interaction, each unexplained moment. The love I held for him now intertwined with anxiety, creating a complicated knot of emotions I couldn't untangle. At night, I would lie awake, replaying each incident over and over, scrutinizing every glance, every word, every pause. I questioned myself constantly. Was I imagining things? Was I being paranoid? Or was my intuition finally whispering the truth I had been avoiding? The uncertainty was exhausting, a slow, creeping weight that made even ordinary moments feel tense. I tried to cling to reason, telling myself that relationships were complex, that everyone had secrets and private spaces. But the weight of the unexplained charges, the odd texts, the small lies, pressed against my mind relentlessly. Each attempt to rationalize fell hollow, and the sense of dread began to grow into something more concrete, something undeniable. Finally, I couldn't ignore it any longer. The accumulation of evidence, however small each piece might seem alone, was beginning to point to a truth I had been terrified to confront. My heart ached with a mixture of fear and grief, a quiet terror that the person I had trusted most might be capable of deception. The small incidents I had tried to dismiss as nothing now loomed large, forming a trail of breadcrumbs toward an unsettling revelation I could no longer avoid. And so, as I sat in the quiet of the evening, sipping tea and staring at the dimly lit kitchen, I understood that these signs weren't coincidences. They weren't harmless quirks or innocent oversights. They were hints, small, subtle, and yet impossible to ignore, that something had been hidden from me for months. A quiet seed of dread had been planted, and I could feel it beginning to grow. It wasn't just the small incidents at home that unsettled me anymore. I began to notice subtle changes in the way our family behaved around him, and it made my stomach twist with unease. My parents, normally warm and chatty, exchanged quiet glances when he walked into the room, their smiles a little too tight, their eyes briefly avoiding his. I tried to ignore it at first, telling myself I was imagining things, that everyone had moods or private worries. During a casual conversation in the living room, my aunt leaned slightly closer to my mother and whispered something I couldn't catch. Both of them glanced at my husband quickly, almost reflexively, before resuming their smiles. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. It was subtle, barely noticeable if you weren't paying attention, but I noticed, and I could feel the tension it carried. There was something unsaid, a shared understanding that excluded me entirely. Even my siblings began to act differently. My sister, normally bubbly and talkative, hesitated when he entered the room, her laughter faltering just a little. My brother avoided making direct eye contact, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. I couldn't understand why. None of them said anything directly, and yet their behavior suggested they knew something, a secret I was not privy to. The sense of exclusion gnawed at me, a quiet isolation that made my chest tighten. At family gatherings, I began to watch more closely. A hushed conversation that stopped abruptly when I approached. A subtle exchange of glances across the table. Small smiles that seemed forced or fleeting. Each observation was like a tiny puzzle piece I couldn't quite fit together, and yet they built a growing sense of unease in my mind. I wanted to confront someone, anyone, to ask what was happening, but I was paralyzed by fear of confirming my suspicions. One afternoon, during preparations for a casual family dinner, I noticed my mother lingering near the kitchen doorway, her hands clasped tightly, her gaze darting toward him. She caught my eye and gave a brief, almost imperceptible shake of her head, then looked away. My heart lurched. Why wouldn't she tell me what was wrong? Why all the secrecy? I felt a mix of panic and frustration, a rising awareness that something serious was being hidden from me. Friends who dropped by occasionally also acted strangely. I noticed their tone change when he entered the room, questions asked with subtle caution, smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. It was as though they were treading lightly, trying not to disturb something delicate. I wanted to ask them outright, to demand honesty, but I hesitated, unsure if I was overreacting or if there was truly something to fear. Even my husband's own behavior around family began to feel strange. He was polite, even charming, but there was a tension in the way he moved, a stiffness I hadn't noticed before. He smiled in the right places, laughed at jokes, yet his eyes betrayed a flicker of anxiety whenever anyone lingered on a topic that might hint at the truth. The contrast between his outward composure and the subtle cues of nervousness made my heart pound in ways I couldn't ignore. I began cataloging the moments, mentally noting every glance, every pause, every fleeting expression, the whispers, the glances, the hesitations. All of it created a mosaic that painted a picture of secrets carefully concealed. I felt isolated, as though I had been excluded from a part of our lives I was always meant to see. The trust one had placed in my family, in my husband, began to feel fragile, like it could shatter with a single word. The sense of being on the outside, looking in, was suffocating. I wanted to confront someone, to ask questions and demand answers, but fear held me back. I didn't know what I might discover, and yet the more I ignored it, the heavier the tension became. It was like walking through a house filled with shadows, hearing whispers just out of reach, sensing the presence of something hidden in plain sight. By the end of the day, I realized I could no longer casually observe. The subtle hints, the discomfort in my family's behavior, the quiet signals of avoidance, they were impossible to overlook. Something was happening behind the facade of normalcy, and I had to pay closer attention. My unease had grown into determination. I needed to notice, to watch, to understand before the truth revealed itself in a way I couldn't control. Even as the house settled into the evening calm, I could feel the tension like a low hum beneath everything. The whispers, the glances, the odd behaviors, they all pointed to one undeniable fact. Something was very wrong. I felt trapped in a quiet web of suspicion, unsure of where it began and how far it extended, but resolute that I would uncover it. The first step was to watch more closely, to be patient, and to trust my instincts. Thanksgiving morning arrived with its usual bustle, but this year the air felt different. Heavier, charged with a tension I couldn't ignore. The kitchen smelled of roasting turkey and melting butter, the scent mingling with the faint aroma of sage and thyme from the stuffing my mother had prepared the night before. The house was alive with movement, kids running between rooms, laughter bouncing off the walls. But beneath it all, my senses were sharper than ever, noticing every detail. I moved through the kitchen carefully, arranging the napkins, checking the silverware, trying to focus on ordinary tasks to calm my racing mind. My husband appeared unusually tense, chopping vegetables with exaggerated precision, glancing at his phone far more often than seemed necessary. Each time he shifted, his expression tightened for just a fraction of a second before smoothing into his usual composed mask. I felt my stomach twist, the familiar sense of unease bubbling into a quiet, gnawing anxiety. As I placed a tray of muffins on the counter, I caught a glimpse of him receiving a message. His hand froze for a heartbeat, eyes scanning the screen rapidly before he slipped it into his pocket. There was a moment, a brief pause, that felt almost intentional, as if he were hiding something from me, even in the midst of morning chaos. My heart skipped. I wanted to ask, to confront, but I stayed silent, pretending to focus on the cranberry sauce, sipping my coffee as if nothing had happened. The kids ran into the kitchen, excited to see the table set and the preparations underway. My mother called out a cheerful instruction, and my husband responded with politeness. Yet his movements were slightly robotic, as if he were performing for an audience rather than participating naturally. Every subtle hesitation, every flicker of distraction made my pulse quicken. The unease I had carried for months now pressed against my chest like a tangible weight. I noticed more inconsistencies than usual. A spoon he had set down a moment ago was now back in a drawer, utensils slightly rearranged without explanation. The oven timer chimed, and he glanced at it with a distracted flicker of worry, then returned to chopping as if nothing had shifted. It was as though he were managing two realities at once: the happy, normal Thanksgiving he presented to the world, and another, hidden layer that only he knew existed. When I asked him a casual question about the stuffing, his reply was slightly delayed, a faint catch in his voice. I could feel a tension in the room, subtle but unmistakable like electricity in the air just before a storm. My mind raced, connecting dots, recalling the strange glances, the odd messages, the little secrets I had tried to dismiss in previous months. Everything that had once seemed minor now loomed with significance, each small clue part of a bigger, undeniable picture. I watched him move around the kitchen, careful not to draw attention to my scrutiny. The way he avoided my gaze, the quick gestures, the slight stiffening of his shoulders, each action screamed louder than words ever could. I felt a cold realization creeping through me. Whatever I had suspected, whatever my instincts had warned, was not just imagination. Something was happening, right here, right now, on this Thanksgiving morning. A subtle change in his demeanor startled me further. He received another phone alert, and this time his hand shook ever so slightly as he read it. He tried to hide it, slipping the phone under a dish towel, but the hesitation was undeniable. My mind raced through every prior incident, the odd receipts, the fleeting texts, the sudden absences. All of it was converging, forming a pattern I could no longer ignore. Even as I continued with my tasks, I could feel my pulse in my ears, a quiet drumbeat of anxiety and fear. The house moved around me in familiar rhythms. The hum of the refrigerator, the laughter of the children, the clinking of utensils. But each sound seemed magnified, sharper, almost warning me that the equilibrium of our home was fragile and about to shatter. I kept my voice calm, pretending to be absorbed in setting the table, yet every nerve in my body was alert. I observed him without accusation, without confrontation, cataloging each micro-expression, each pause, each flicker of something hidden. My chest tightened with anticipation, dread weaving itself into the familiar warmth of the morning. Finally, a small, almost imperceptible slip caught my attention. He muttered a name under his breath, barely audible, and quickly corrected himself when he realized I might have heard. The sound was fleeting, but it carried a weight I couldn't ignore. It confirmed what I had suspected for months. The perfect veneer of our life hid a deeper truth, one he had been carefully concealing. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air thick with tension I could barely contain. I realized that today, Thanksgiving, the day I had always associated with warmth, gratitude, and family, had become a day my world would change. My heart pounded with fear and disbelief, and yet beneath it all, a quiet clarity settled in. I would not let this go unnoticed. The betrayal I had sensed, the unease I had carried, was no longer abstract. It was real, tangible, and unfolding in front of me. By the time I carried the last platter to the table, I felt a mixture of shock and determination. The evidence, subtle yet undeniable, had revealed itself in these small moments. The distracted glances, the hidden messages, the unnatural tension. I knew with certainty that the day would no longer be ordinary. Something significant, something devastating was about to be exposed. And as I set the final fork in place, a quiet resolve grew inside me. I would face it, and I would not turn away. Later that afternoon, while the house buzzed with pre-dinner activity, I found myself unable to stop thinking about the subtle clues from the morning. My husband was busy in the kitchen, chopping and arranging, but his earlier glances at the phone and the faint hesitation still lingered in my mind. The unease that had been quietly growing for months now pressed against my chest like a physical weight. I knew I had to look closer, even if it meant stepping into a space I had avoided for so long. I waited until he stepped into the living room to check on the kids, and quietly slipped toward his study. It was a room he claimed was for work, but something inside me whispered that it held secrets. My hand shook slightly as I opened the laptop, the soft click of the hinge echoing in the otherwise quiet house. A mix of fear and determination churned inside me, but I knew I couldn't ignore the signs any longer. The truth, whatever it was, had to be found here. Emails and messages appeared on the screen, some mundane, others startlingly revealing. There were names I didn't recognize, conversations that hinted at intimacy, receipts for dinners, and small gifts that weren't meant for me. Each click and scroll felt like peeling back layers of a carefully constructed life, and with each revelation, my heart sank further. The reality I had sensed, the suspicion I had tried to quiet, was undeniable. I paused to steady my breathing, the hum of the laptop loud in the silent room. It was as if the house itself held its breath alongside me. My hands trembled as I sifted through the correspondence, piecing together dates, locations, and names. The deeper I dug, the more apparent it became. He had been living a dual life, one that had remained hidden behind the veneer of routine and perfection. The betrayal was not a fleeting lapse or an innocent mistake. It was deliberate, ongoing, and hidden from everyone, including me. Receipts for hotels, gifts, and dinners he claimed were work-related now told a different story. Messages left on his phone for someone else, quickly deleted but recoverable through the laptop's history, confirmed what my instincts had whispered for months. My mind spun as I connected the dots, a mix of disbelief, heartbreak, and anger rising within me. The man I had loved, trusted, and built a life with had been keeping secrets, deep, intimate, and sustained secrets right under my nose. I sank into the chair, my hands clutching the edges as a wave of panic washed over me. I felt exposed, not just by his actions, but by the realization that I had been unaware for so long. The house, once warm and comforting, now felt oppressive, as if the walls themselves held the weight of deceit. Every sound, the faint laughter of the kids, the clinking of utensils from the kitchen, the distant hum of traffic outside, felt magnified, each a reminder of the life that had continued around me while I remained oblivious to the hidden truth. I kept scanning the emails and messages, noting the consistency of deception. There were confirmations, plans, casual messages written in a tone that suggested familiarity and intimacy. The clarity was shocking. This was not a one-time mistake, not a casual flirtation. It was a fully formed, hidden relationship running in parallel to our life together. My chest tightened with a mix of grief and rage, a heavy, physical knot that seemed impossible to release. Even as I absorbed the evidence, I found myself planning. My mind worked quickly, cataloging the details, remembering the months of subtle clues I had tried to dismiss. I realized that confronting him needed precision. I couldn't allow him to hide behind excuses or gaslight me. Not this time. The information I had found was undeniable, and I needed a strategy that would reveal the truth without giving him a chance to twist it. I closed the laptop briefly, taking a deep breath as I tried to steady my emotions. The shock was still there, raw and pulsing, but underneath it was something sharper, a quiet resolve. I knew that I would confront him, that I would not let this continue unchecked. The betrayal was real, and the moment to address it was coming, though I didn't yet reveal how or when. I allowed myself a few minutes to process, leaning back in the chair and letting the weight of realization settle. The betrayal wasn't just in the messages or the receipts. It was in the secrecy, the deliberate concealment, the life he had created parallel to ours. My chest ached with grief, a deep sorrow for the trust broken, for the life we had thought was shared and real. But alongside it, a spark of clarity and determination flickered. I would confront him, and I would do it on my terms. By the time I left the study and returned to the kitchen, the sense of betrayal had solidified into focus. I knew exactly what I had discovered and what it meant. The quiet panic had transformed into resolve. The evidence, carefully uncovered, left no room for doubt. And as I washed my hands and returned to the bustle of Thanksgiving preparations, I carried with me a single, unyielding thought. This would not go unanswered. After uncovering the hidden messages and receipts, I couldn't stop thinking about the months of small incidents I'd tried to ignore. Each forgotten detail, each unusual glance, every late-night disappearance suddenly made sense. I replayed them in my mind, connecting dots I had once dismissed, realizing that my intuition had been correct all along. The picture was coming together, and it was far worse than I had imagined. I began cataloging everything in my head. The receipts for dinners at unfamiliar restaurants, the texts he had quickly hidden, the unexplained charges on our credit cards. Even the fleeting, almost imperceptible moments of avoidance, the sudden phone alerts, the awkward pauses in conversation, fit into a pattern I could no longer deny. What I had once chalked up to stress or work now screamed of deliberate deception. The puzzle pieces fell into place, forming an image I had been dreading. He had been hiding another life, carefully constructing a parallel world that existed alongside ours. I could see the timeline of his duplicity, how small actions and lies had been layered over months to maintain the illusion of normalcy. The realization hit me like a cold wave. I had been living beside a stranger, someone who shared my home, but not my honesty. I thought about the small moments that now seemed so telling. The secretive smiles at a text, the sudden tone shifts during mundane conversations, the inexplicable absences. All of them were no longer coincidences. They were deliberate attempts to keep me unaware. The clarity of it made my heart ache, but it also sharpened my focus. I wasn't just hurt, I was determined to confront this betrayal. As I sorted through the evidence, I realized the scope of the deception. It wasn't just occasional secrecy or harmless flirtation. The messages, the meetings, the gifts, they all pointed to a full-blown hidden relationship, maintained with precision and care. Every small incident I had tried to excuse suddenly became a flag I could not ignore. The betrayal was real, deliberate, and extensive. My emotions were a storm. Anger, grief, shock, and disbelief rolled together in a chaotic swell. I felt betrayed in a way that went beyond infidelity. It was the breach of trust that underpinned everything in our life together. The very foundation of our marriage, the routines, the shared home, even the small joys of everyday life. They were all tainted by the knowledge that I had been deceived. Yet, amidst the turmoil, a quiet determination emerged. I realized that knowledge was power. I had evidence now, a clear picture of months of hidden actions. I could confront him, but I needed strategy. I needed patience. This was not a moment for rash decisions. It was a moment to ensure that the truth would be undeniable, in a way that he could not twist or deny. I began planning silently in my mind. Every detail mattered, the timing, the place, the words I would use. Thanksgiving dinner, with the whole family present, would be the stage. I imagined the tension of the moment, the disbelief, the silent shock as the truth unfolded. I knew that when it happened, there could be no deflection, no chance for him to manipulate the narrative. The preparation, both emotional and logistical, became my focus. Even as I organized my thoughts, I felt the weight of grief pressing against me. The man I had trusted with my life had created an entire secret world I had never known. The realization was painful, a sting that lingered with every breath. But it was also a catalyst, sharpening my resolve. I would not allow months of deception to control me. I would face the truth head-on my terms, and ensure that it could never be hidden again. The afternoon passed in a blur of chores and preparation, but my mind remained fixated on the revelations. I reviewed the evidence over and over, piecing together the timeline, the interactions, the messages. Each piece added clarity, reinforcing the certainty that confrontation was not only necessary, but inevitable. I felt a mix of fear and power, knowing that the moment of exposure would be decisive. By the time the first hints of golden light filtered through the windows, I had formed a complete mental map of the months of betrayal. I could see the web he had woven, the careful duplicity, the meticulous effort to conceal it all. And alongside the grief and anger, I felt an undeniable sense of readiness. I was prepared. I had the truth. And I would reveal, I teed up by the time the dining room was set. The house had settled into a seemingly normal rhythm. The turkey rested on the carving board, steaming and golden, surrounded by bowls of stuffing, mashed potatoes, and cranberry sauce. The kids ran between chairs and tables, laughing and chattering, completely unaware of the undercurrent of tension that had gripped me. Every detail looked perfect, the table polished, the candles lit, but I could feel the weight of what was about to happen pressing against me like an invisible fog. My husband moved through the room with practiced ease, smiling at relatives, sharing casual jokes, and offering wine to anyone who wanted it. He looked on the surface like the man I had married years ago, but I could see the subtle tells now, the brief flickers of worry in his eyes, the way his hand shook slightly when he reached for a dish, the faint tension in his jaw. Every micro-expression added another layer to the tight coil of anxiety and anticipation in my chest. I took my seat at the head of the table, hands folded, eyes scanning the faces of family members. Everyone seemed oblivious to the storm quietly building around us. The air smelled of roasted turkey, sweet pies, and the faint tang of autumn leaves drifting in through the open windows. I could hear the soft scrape of silverware against plates and the murmur of conversation, yet each sound seemed to magnify the suspense, like the prelude to a storm. Small talk filled the gaps, and I contributed lightly, laughing at the right moments, making polite comments, but my mind was far from casual. I watched him, noting the little hesitations, the flickers of discomfort, the way he avoided meeting my gaze directly. The contrast between the normalcy around us and the tension I felt made my pulse race. I realized that in a few moments, the balance of this Thanksgiving would shift forever. Each relative seemed to bring subtle cues that heightened my awareness. My mother's occasional sideways glances, the way my aunt leaned slightly closer to whisper something to my cousin, the way my siblings' eyes lingered a beat too long on him. All of it added to the intricate web of unease. I could feel it building in the room, a tension that no one addressed, a quiet electricity running beneath the polished surface of holiday cheer. I took slow, deliberate breaths, trying to center myself. The warmth of the room and the familiar smells were comforting, but they contrasted sharply with the racing thoughts in my mind. I reminded myself to stay calm, to measure every move, every glance, every word. The entire confrontation depended on timing, and I could not afford to act impulsively. My chest tightened with both fear and determination, a delicate balance I had to maintain. My husband carved the turkey with precise, controlled movements. He smiled at family members as he served them, but there was a stiffness, a faint tremor in his hands that betrayed his composure. Each action, no matter how seemingly ordinary, was now charged with meaning. I watched him with a clarity I had not possessed before, cataloging every micro-expression, every hesitation, every glance that might hint at the deception I had uncovered. As dinner progressed, I felt the internal battle intensify. On one hand, I wanted to hold it in, to maintain the illusion of normalcy for the sake of family harmony. On the other hand, the knowledge of his betrayal burned within me, demanding to be revealed. I sipped my water slowly, letting the cool liquid calm my racing thoughts. But my mind was already rehearsing the confrontation that would soon unfold. The conversation around the table was light, filled with anecdotes, laughter, and casual comments about work, school, and family events. Yet I noticed how he seemed to flinch at some questions, how he offered vague answers, and how his eyes darted subtly toward his phone on the counter. Each small misstep, each tiny clue, strengthened my resolve. I understood with absolute certainty that this was the moment to act. The perfect storm had arrived. As the meal continued, I could feel the weight of every choice pressing against me. The room, filled with familiar sounds and comforting aromas, now seemed like a stage. Each person, each smile, each polite exchange was a backdrop to a tension that only I fully understood. My heart pounded, but beneath it was a sharp clarity. The betrayal I had uncovered would no longer remain hidden, and I would ensure that the truth would be seen, heard, and undeniable. By the time the first slice of pie was being served, I felt a quiet focus settle over me. The stage was set, the audience present, and the tension had reached a peak. I had cataloged every detail, rehearsed every thought, and prepared myself for the moment of truth. The air, thick with the scent of baked apples and cinnamon, seemed to vibrate with anticipation. I took one final, steadying breath, letting the warmth of the room mask the storm inside, knowing that soon, everything would change. As conversation flowed around the table, I felt my pulse quicken with every word he spoke. He laughed at a joke one of my cousins told, but there was a slight tremor in his smile, a hesitation in his tone that seemed off. I noticed the way his eyes flicked toward the corner of the room, then quickly back to the table, as if expecting something or someone that didn't belong there. That brief, almost imperceptible glance made my chest tighten. I sipped my water slowly, pretending to focus on the conversation about the kids' school projects. But I couldn't help watching him, noting every movement. His hand lingered just a little too long on his napkin. His posture stiffened when my aunt reached across the table to pass the gravy, and his fork trembled slightly as he cut the turkey. Each small action screamed that he was hiding something, and the realization made my stomach knot with dread. Then it happened, subtle, almost accidental, but unmistakable. A comment slipped out, a name he muttered under his breath while laughing at a story about his coworker. His eyes widened for just a fraction of a second when he realized he had spoken aloud, and he tried to cover it with a cough. But it was enough. Enough for my mind to click into place, connecting the words to the messages, the receipts, the small discrepancies I had cataloged over months. I felt a surge of righteous anger mixed with sorrow. My fingers tightened around my napkin, the fabric crumpling slightly under the tension. I wanted to scream, to confront him immediately, but I knew the timing had to be perfect. The evidence had to speak louder than emotion alone. I sat back slightly, letting the slips sink in, absorbing the shock while maintaining control. My family continued talking, oblivious to the subtle but charged moment that had just passed. I watched him more closely, observing the nervous twitch in his eye and the slight reddening of his cheeks. He avoided eye contact with me, his smile forced, as if the slip had been a minor mistake that no one would notice. But I had noticed, and in that instant, I felt the weight of every lie he had told pressing down on me. I remembered all the small signs I had dismissed in the past. The secretive phone calls, the unusual texts, the inexplicable absences. They all made sense now. This slip, accidental or not, confirmed what I had feared. The man I loved and trusted had been living a life I wasn't allowed to see. The realization cut through me, sharp and icy, leaving a mixture of grief and determination in its wake. My mind raced through the months of careful deception, cataloging every detail I had once doubted. Each unexplained charge, each secretive message, each tiny inconsistency now became part of a clear and undeniable pattern. The betrayal was no longer abstract. It was tangible, undeniable, and directly in front of me. The pieces of the puzzle had finally aligned, leaving nothing to excuse or rationalize. I felt a quiet resolve begin to form, a firm decision taking root in my chest. The slip had given me the confirmation I needed, and now the question wasn't whether I would confront him, it was how and when. The moment had come to take control, to ensure that the truth would no longer remain hidden, and to finally claim the justice I had been denied for months. As the conversation around the table continued, I allowed myself a brief exhale. The room seemed to hum with normalcy. The clink of silverware, the laughter of my cousins, the soft murmur of polite chatter, but beneath it, a quiet tension simmered. I could feel the anticipation building inside me, a slow-burning certainty that the exposure was near. Every glance, every gesture from him now carried weight, and I was ready to act. By the time the first bite of dessert was passed around, I had already begun rehearsing the confrontation in my mind. The slip had made everything real. It had pulled back the curtain on months of deception. I felt a mix of anger, grief, and control, a quiet intensity that would guide me in the coming moments. I was ready to reveal what had been hidden, to turn the whispers and half-truths into clarity, and to reclaim the power that had been stolen from me. The truth settled over me like a cold, unyielding fog. Sitting at the Thanksgiving table, surrounded by family, I finally understood the depth of the betrayal I had been sensing for months. It wasn't just small lies or fleeting secrets. It was a carefully maintained deception, a life hidden alongside mine, a reality I had never been allowed to see. My chest ached, a dull, heavy pain that seemed to press down on every part of me. I watched him laugh with my cousins, his movements seemingly effortless, yet each gesture now carried a duplicity I couldn't ignore. I remembered the secret messages, the receipts, the late-night disappearances, and suddenly they were all unmistakably connected. The warmth I had once felt toward him, the comfort of shared routines, the safety of a familiar life, was now replaced with shock, grief, and a sharp, simmering anger that I couldn't contain. My mind replayed every moment I had previously brushed aside. The unusual glances, the sudden phone alerts, the unexplained absences. All the subtle signs I had doubted now screamed the truth. The man I had trusted, the person I had invited into every corner of my life, had spent months, maybe years, hiding an entirely separate world from me. I felt a wave of nausea, an almost physical response to the depth of the deceit. Even as I tried to steady my breathing, my thoughts raced. How could I have missed it? How could all the subtle signals I had sensed, all the unease, have gone unheeded for so long? The realization was brutal. Love and trust had blinded me, and I had been unknowingly complicit in my own vulnerability. My hands tightened around the napkin in my lap, the fabric crumpling beneath my grip, grounding me in the present while my mind swirled with disbelief. I thought about the life we had built together, the vacations, the weekends spent in laughter, the quiet evenings talking about our dreams. Those memories now felt tainted, each one shadowed by the knowledge that he had been living a life apart from me, a life I had never shared. I felt an overwhelming sense of grief, not just for the betrayal, but for the years of misplaced trust, for the innocence of believing in what I had thought was a perfect marriage. The room around me continued its Thanksgiving hum. The clinking of silverware, the laughter of my cousins, the soft chatter of polite conversation. But it all felt distant, muted under the weight of what I had realized. I felt isolated, as though I were watching life from behind a glass wall, separated from the normalcy everyone else seemed to inhabit. The contrast between the warmth of the room and the cold truth I carried inside me was jarring, almost unbearable. Anger began to rise, sharp and undeniable, cutting through the grief that had initially taken hold. I felt furious at him, at the calculated effort to deceive, at the emotional manipulation that had allowed this hidden life to persist. Yet the anger was tempered by clarity. I knew that acting impulsively now would only give him room to evade responsibility. I needed precision, patience, control. This was not a moment for an outburst. It was a moment for strategy. My heart ached, a raw, heavy pain that mingled grief and fury. I realized that the confrontation I had long prepared for was not just about exposing him. It was about reclaiming myself, reclaiming the power and trust that had been stolen. I felt a steady resolve building beneath the shock, a quiet determination to ensure that the betrayal could no longer hide behind charm, routine, or polite conversation. I glanced around the table, noting the faces of family members, all unaware of the full story. The contrast made the weight of my responsibility even more acute. I could see the trust and warmth in their expressions, and I knew that exposing the truth had to be done carefully, deliberately, to ensure that it was undeniable in the presence of everyone who mattered. The moment of clarity also brought a profound sadness. I mourned not just for what had been lost, but for the person I had believed him to be, for the life we had shared in good faith, for the sense of security and love that had been an illusion. And yet, beneath the grief, a quiet, simmering strength began to take root. I understood that I could not undo the past, but I could control what happened next. As the conversation around the table continued, my hands resting lightly on the edges of my plate, I felt my mind sharpen. The betrayal was fully clear now. The evidence, the signs, the months of unease, all of it pointed to a reality I could no longer ignore. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the full weight of heartbreak and anger mingling inside me, and resolved to face him directly. Today, at this very table, everything would change. The room was filled with the usual warmth and chatter of Thanksgiving, but inside me, a storm was building. I could feel every heartbeat, every pulse of tension, as I watched him interact with the family, unaware that the veil was about to be lifted. The turkey sat steaming in the center of the table, the sweet aroma of pies and spices blending with the quiet hum of conversation. Everything looked ordinary, but nothing would remain that way for long. I waited for the perfect moment, letting my resolve harden with each passing second. My hands rested lightly on the table, but they trembled slightly under the weight of anticipation. I wanted the truth to be clear, undeniable, so I spoke calmly, my voice soft but deliberate. "I think it's time we talk," I said, letting my eyes lock with his. The laughter around the table faltered, and several heads turned, sensing the shift in energy. His eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing his face, but he quickly masked it with a nervous smile. "About what?" he asked, trying to keep the tone casual, though his voice betrayed the slightest edge of tension. I took a slow breath, steadying myself, letting the moment stretch just long enough for everyone to notice. The room had gone quiet now, all eyes subtly shifting toward us, the energy thick with anticipation. "I know about the messages, the receipts, the dinners you've been keeping secret," I said, my voice unwavering. "I know you've been hiding someone from all of us, from me. And it stops today." There was a pause as the words sank in, a hush falling over the table. His hand twitched slightly, reaching for the napkin, and I noticed the tension in his shoulders tighten. The family was silent, sensing the gravity of what was unfolding. He tried to speak, to offer a denial, but I raised a hand gently to stop him. "No excuses," I said, my tone firm but controlled. "We've been living a lie. Months of deception, hiding a life from me, and now it's out in the open." The room remained quiet, the family exchanging shocked glances, some mouths slightly open in disbelief. I could feel their confusion, their concern, and I knew the truth needed to be delivered clearly, without ambiguity. He opened his mouth again, fumbling for words, but I continued, keeping my voice steady, measured. "I've seen the messages, the receipts, the patterns of absence you try to hide. I've pieced it together, and the betrayal is undeniable." I let the words hang in the air, their weight settling on every person in the room. The warmth of the holiday gathering had shifted, replaced by a tense silence that screamed of accountability. His eyes darted to the family, searching for support, for an escape, but there was none. Everyone was watching, waiting for him to respond, for the facade to crumble. And it did. The mask slipped ever so slightly, revealing a flash of guilt, of fear, and for the first time, vulnerability. I felt a mixture of triumph and sadness. Triumph because the truth could no longer be denied, sadness for the life we had thought we shared that had been so carefully constructed on lies. I kept my tone calm, letting clarity guide me. This is not just about disappointment or hurt feelings. This is about honesty, integrity, and respect. You've hidden months of your life from me, and now everyone knows. There's no way to explain away, no way to avoid the consequences. My voice did not waver, even though inside, a storm of emotions, rage, grief, relief, raged fiercely. He swallowed hard, words failing him, as the family absorbed the magnitude of the confession. My parents' eyes were wide. My siblings leaned forward. My cousins whispered softly, but all of them understood without needing further explanation. The truth was undeniable, laid bare with precision and calm, and I felt a quiet satisfaction in the power of clarity. I paused, letting my eyes meet his one final time. "I deserve honesty," I said softly but firmly. "I've lived months in the dark, and that ends now. There's no more hiding, no more lies." The room remained still, the weight of the revelation pressing on everyone present. My husband's shoulders slumped slightly, the realization settling in that the deception he had nurtured so carefully could no longer stand. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, the family began to react, expressions of shock, support, and disbelief spreading across faces. My heart pounded, but I felt grounded in the knowledge that the truth was finally exposed, undeniable and complete. I had chosen my moment carefully, and it had arrived perfectly. The Thanksgiving I had once thought ordinary had transformed into a reckoning, a turning point that could no longer be ignored. By the time the conversation cautiously resumed, I felt a quiet sense of release. The betrayal was fully revealed, the truth laid bare in front of everyone who mattered. My husband could no longer hide, no longer deflect, and I could finally begin to reclaim the control and dignity that had been denied to me for months. The tension lingered, but now it was paired with clarity, a sense that justice, however measured, had been served. The room remained tense long after the confession, the air heavy with the weight of revelation. Everyone seemed frozen for a moment, processing what they had just witnessed. My husband sat quietly, shoulders slumped, eyes avoiding everyone in the room. I felt a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion settle over me, as though a burden I hadn't fully acknowledged had finally been lifted. Family members exchanged quiet words, whispers filled with surprise, disbelief, and concern. My parents' faces were a mixture of shock and sympathy. My siblings looked worried but supportive, and my cousin's eyes lingered on me with unspoken questions. It was a strange, surreal sensation, watching the people I loved react to a reality I had known for months. I realized that the truth, once revealed, carried a weight that affected everyone, not just me. I felt my chest loosen slightly, the knot of anxiety that had been tightening for months beginning to ease. The betrayal still stung, deep and sharp, but there was clarity now, and clarity brought a strange sense of empowerment. I could finally stop replaying small suspicions, second-guessing my instincts, and pretending that everything was fine. The hidden life my husband had built could no longer exist behind closed doors, and the truth had reclaimed its rightful place. The conversation gradually resumed, though carefully and measuredly. Family members asked questions, hesitated, then gently offered support. My father placed a hand on my shoulder, a quiet reassurance that I wasn't alone. My mother's voice trembled slightly as she expressed concern for how I must have felt, and I allowed myself to absorb the comfort even as the ache of betrayal lingered. Their support, though quiet, was grounding, a reminder that I had not been the only one deceived by circumstance. I reflected on the months I had spent questioning myself, wondering if I had been imagining the inconsistencies, the glances, the strange behavior. Now, the pieces had all come together, and there could be no doubt. My instincts had been correct all along. The man I had trusted had been living a parallel life, and my perception of reality had been manipulated. It was a bitter realization, but it came with a strange sense of vindication. My husband remained mostly silent, occasionally attempting to speak, but the words faltered under the weight of accountability. I felt a mixture of anger and pity, recognizing the contrast between his carefully maintained facade and the undeniable truth now visible to all. The skillful deception, the casual charm, the cultivated normalcy, all of it had been stripped away in one calm, deliberate revelation. The balance of power had shifted. Even as family members processed the information, I could feel my own emotions stabilizing. The grief, anger, and disbelief were still present, but they had transformed into focus and determination. I realized that moving forward, I had to reclaim not only my life, but also my sense of self and agency. I had endured months of deception, but now I could set the boundaries, make the decisions, and ensure that my dignity remained intact. I took stock of the evidence, the months of clues I had pieced together, and felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The betrayal had been exposed, undeniable and complete, and I could finally act with knowledge rather than suspicion. My mind began planning next steps, practical steps to protect myself emotionally, socially, and financially. There was a calm determination beneath the heartbreak, a recognition that I had survived the deceit and could now navigate the aftermath with control. The family, slowly regaining composure, began to offer words of encouragement, subtle support, and validation. Their reactions were varied, some shocked, some sympathetic, some quietly observing, but I felt the weight of isolation lift slightly. I was no longer alone in knowing the truth. The betrayal was no longer mine to carry in silence. It was acknowledged, witnessed, and recognized by those who mattered most. By the end of the evening, the house had quieted, the remnants of Thanksgiving still scattered across tables and counters. I sat back, processing everything that had transpired, feeling the full impact of both the grief and the empowerment. The truth had been revealed, and with it, the first steps toward reclaiming my life had begun. I understood that the road ahead would not be easy, but the clarity and support I now possessed provided a foundation to rebuild, stronger and wiser than before. In the days following Thanksgiving, I realized that confronting the betrayal was only the beginning. The exposure had lifted the veil, but I still needed to reclaim control over my life and the aspects of it that had been quietly manipulated. I felt a simmering sense of purpose, a quiet determination to ensure that justice did not come through anger or chaos, but through careful, deliberate actions. I started with finances. I reviewed our accounts, meticulously checking for inconsistencies or hidden expenditures. Months of subtle manipulation and unexplained transactions had left a trail, and I followed it patiently, cataloging each discrepancy. The realization that I had been financially sidelined made the betrayal feel even more tangible, but it also fueled my resolve. I would reclaim what was rightfully mine, methodically, with precision. Next, I considered social boundaries. Friends who had been subtly influenced by his duplicity were approached gently, but firmly. I clarified my position, setting limits on conversations and interactions that had previously allowed his lies to spread unchallenged. Each conversation, measured and calm, was a reclaiming of agency, a restoration of trust in my own judgment. I could feel strength growing with every boundary established, an empowerment that came not from revenge, but from control. Even in our home, I began to implement subtle changes. I took ownership of shared spaces, reorganizing and asserting authority over areas that had previously been manipulated. Small actions, moving files, organizing closets, reclaiming routines, felt symbolic, almost ritualistic, a quiet assertion that I would no longer allow manipulation to dictate my life. Each step reinforced the sense that the betrayal, though painful, could be contained and addressed intelligently. Emotionally, I worked to stabilize myself. I journaled extensively, pouring out grief, anger, and disappointment, and then transforming those emotions into clear plans. Therapy sessions helped me process the shock and the loss of trust, giving me tools to navigate the social and emotional consequences. I realized that quiet justice was not about humiliation or public shame. It was about reclaiming myself, my dignity, and my sense of equilibrium. I also addressed the ongoing relationship with my husband. Conversations were deliberate, factual, and unyielding. I required accountability, insisted on transparency, and refused to allow deflection or gaslighting. Each exchange was structured to protect my own interests while forcing him to confront the consequences of his actions. I felt a quiet satisfaction as he realized that manipulation would no longer be tolerated, that I had reclaimed authority over our shared life. Friends and family who had been witnesses to the revelation became allies in subtle ways, supporting boundaries and reinforcing the clarity of truth. Their validation bolstered my confidence, and I learned that justice could be implemented strategically, without drama, by ensuring that my personal boundaries were respected and that deceit could no longer operate in the shadows. Small victories accumulated. Hidden accounts were closed, unexplained debts addressed, and secrets that had once given him leverage were rendered powerless. Each step, careful and deliberate, strengthened my sense of autonomy. I was no longer reacting impulsively to betrayal. I was acting strategically, reclaiming control, and protecting myself from further manipulation. The sense of closure did not come with fanfare. There was no dramatic confrontation, no public spectacle. Instead, it came quietly in the steadiness of regained control and the affirmation of my own judgment. I had taken months of deception and turned it into actionable clarity, ensuring that my life could move forward without fear of hidden sabotage or manipulation. Even as I look back on the betrayal, I realized that the process of quiet justice had given me something more valuable than revenge: empowerment. I had faced the deceit with clarity, addressed its consequences with intelligence, and reasserted my dignity without compromising my integrity. The process left me stronger, resilient, and confident in my ability to navigate any future challenges. By the end of that period, I could walk through my home, interact with family, and manage my life with a newfound sense of calm authority. The betrayal still stung, but it no longer controlled me. I had implemented justice quietly, effectively, and strategically, turning pain into empowerment. And in that, I found a peace that was stronger than any public vindication could have provided. In the quiet days after the storm, I found myself reflecting deeply on everything that had happened. The betrayal, the confrontation, the aftermath. It all felt surreal at times, yet each moment had left an indelible mark on my understanding of trust, resilience, and personal strength. I realized that while the pain had been sharp and consuming, it had also opened a door to clarity and growth I hadn't expected. I thought about the months of subtle signs I tried to ignore, the uneasy feeling that something wasn't right. My intuition, which I had questioned so often, had been correct all along. That realization brought both regret and gratitude. Regret for the time lost in doubt, but gratitude for the inner voice that had guided me toward truth. I understood now that trusting my instincts was not just wise, but necessary, a lesson I would carry forward. Looking back on the confrontation at Thanksgiving, I could still feel the tension in my chest, the weight of words spoken carefully, deliberately, and with purpose. That moment had been pivotal, not only in exposing the betrayal, but in reclaiming my own sense of agency. It was a turning point where I had chosen clarity over confusion, truth over illusion, and self-respect over denial. The relief I felt in finally letting the secret surface was profound, a mixture of empowerment and quiet sorrow. I reflected on the months of careful recovery that followed, setting boundaries, reclaiming finances, and asserting control over personal spaces were not acts of revenge. They were acts of self-preservation. Each small victory strengthened my confidence and reminded me that intelligence and patience could achieve far more than impulsive anger. I learned that empowerment did not always come with drama. It often came quietly, through deliberate, thoughtful action. The experience had also reshaped how I viewed relationships and trust. I realized that trust must be continually earned and observed, not taken for granted. While betrayal can wound deeply, it also serves as a test of personal resilience and clarity. I found a renewed sense of respect for myself, for my ability to process the truth, and for the courage it took to act decisively in the face of deceit. Emotionally, I felt stronger. The grief and anger had not vanished entirely, but they had transformed into a sense of measured understanding. I could acknowledge the hurt without letting it dominate my life. Each reflection, each journal entry, and each conversation with trusted friends helped solidify a foundation of emotional strength that I knew would carry me forward. I was no longer merely reacting. I was learning, growing, and reclaiming control over my life. I also considered the lessons for the future. I recognized the importance of observation, communication, and intuition. Small inconsistencies, subtle behaviors, and unexplained patterns are never meaningless. They are signals, sometimes faint, sometimes loud, that demand attention. Trust is vital, but so is vigilance, and I had learned to balance both without becoming paranoid or suspicious of every action. Family became an anchor during this time. Their support, quiet as it often was, reminded me that betrayal does not have to be faced alone. The shared recognition of truth and the solidarity they offered provided strength and perspective. I realized that relationships, whether familial or personal, thrive not just on trust, but on mutual accountability, honesty, and respect. Looking toward the future, I felt cautious optimism. I knew the road ahead would require rebuilding and reassessment of priorities, but I also knew I was equipped to handle it. The betrayal had tested me, but it had not broken me. Instead, it had illuminated my inner strength, my capacity for patience, and my ability to turn adversity into empowerment. I felt a quiet pride in the path I had taken, from suspicion to discovery, confrontation to recovery. Each step had demanded courage, clarity, and careful thought. The life I was moving into was not defined by betrayal, but by resilience, intelligence, and a knowledge that I could trust myself to navigate challenges with integrity. As I closed this chapter in my life, I allowed myself a moment of calm reflection. The pain remained, softened by perspective, but the empowerment lingered stronger. I had reclaimed my dignity, my peace, and my future. I looked forward with eyes wide open, wiser, stronger, and ready to rebuild a life defined not by deceit, but by the lessons of courage, patience, and self-respect.